Late in 260 BC, in the mountain valleys of northern China, General Zhao Qi led the last organized attack of a dying army. For 46 days, according to the historian Sima Qian, Qin troops had held the roads behind him and the fortified ground ahead. No grain carts had reached the Zhao camp. No relief army had opened a passage home. Men who had marched into Changping as part of one of the greatest military forces in China were now trapped inside a shrinking pocket of ground, weakened by hunger and separated from the defenses that had once protected them. Waiting meant starvation. Zhao Qi therefore divided the survivors into several formations and ordered them against the blockade. They did not face an enemy caught in confusion. Qin missile troops were waiting behind prepared positions, covering the narrow routes through which the Zhao soldiers had to pass. The breakout failed. Zhao Qi was struck and killed. When the attacks finally stopped, the surviving soldiers of Zhao had no commander, no food, and no open road. They laid down their weapons. That should have ended the battle. Instead, it opened the darkest part of the story. Ancient accounts claim that approximately 400,000 men surrendered at Changping. The exact total is disputed and may have included transport workers, camp laborers, displaced inhabitants of Shangdang, and other support personnel as well as trained soldiers. Yet, even if Sima Qian's figure was exaggerated, Qin had captured a population large enough to become a crisis of its own. Keeping the prisoners would require enormous quantities of grain and thousands of guards. Releasing them would allow Zhao to rebuild the army Qin had spent months destroying. Marching them west through hostile territory could invite escape, rebellion, or attack. The decision belonged to Bai Qi, Qin's most feared commander. He had not won by overpowering Zhao in one great collision. He had allowed its soldiers to advance, slipped troops behind them, closed the roads, and waited while hunger did what repeated assaults could not. Now he decided that the surrendered army would not be allowed to exist. Sima Qian wrote that nearly all the prisoners were massacred and consigned to pits. Almost none returned to Zhao. Later tradition would describe 400,000 men being buried alive, although the surviving language and archaeological evidence do not establish that precise method of death. The number is uncertain, the killing is not, and the question that makes Changping more than a story of slaughter is how an army this large was trapped so completely that surrender became its only choice. The answer begins before Bai Qi took command and before Zhao Qi arrived at the front. It begins with a mountain territory called Shangdang, offered to Zhao as a gift that could not be accepted without risking war, and could not be refused without strengthening Qin. By the 3rd century BC, China was divided among rival kingdoms engaged in an increasingly ruthless contest for survival. The Zhou king remained a figure of ritual importance, but he no longer possessed the power to control the states that acknowledged him. Real authority belonged to rulers who commanded their own officials, armies, tax systems, and territories. 7 states dominated the political landscape: Qin, Zhao, Han, Wei, Chu, Qi, and Yan. They competed through diplomacy, espionage, alliances, sieges, territorial exchanges, and almost continuous war. A victory rarely ended a conflict. It shifted the frontier and created the conditions for the next campaign. Warfare had also changed. Earlier armies had been centered on aristocratic warriors, chariots, and the armed followers of noble families. By the time of Changping, rulers could register households and mobilize large portions of the population. Commoners served as infantrymen, crossbowmen, laborers, drivers, craftsmen, and supply workers. Roads, fortified depots, agricultural production, and administrative records became as important as individual bravery. The resulting armies were far larger than those of earlier centuries. although the totals recorded in ancient histories should not always be read as counts of fully equipped combat troops. When a source described hundreds of thousands of soldiers, that figure might include the entire military population supporting a campaign. At the center of this struggle stood Qin. Qin's heartland lay in the west, around the Wei River Valley. Mountains and passes protected much of its territory, while reforms carried out during the previous century had strengthened the ruler's control over land, taxation, law, and military service. Households were organized so the state could count them, tax them, and mobilize them. Soldiers could gain rank through battlefield achievement. Officers faced severe consequences for failure. This system did not guarantee victory, but it gave Qin a remarkable capacity to organize its population for war. Defeated armies could be replaced. Conquered territory could be incorporated into new administrative districts. Roads and supply centers allowed future campaigns to begin farther east. Under King Zhao, Qin attacked its neighbors with unusual persistence. Rather than trying to conquer all of them at once, it frequently isolated one opponent, secured its flanks through diplomacy, and concentrated overwhelming pressure on the chosen target. Among the generals who carried out those campaigns was Bai Qi. Bai Qi appears in the historical record through action rather than speeches. He repeatedly led Qin forces against Han, Wei, Chu, and Zhao, and his victories were often followed by enormous casualty claims. At Yikui in 293 BC, ancient sources credited him with defeating the combined armies of Han and Wei and killing 240,000 men. Later, he invaded Chu, captured its capital region, and forced the kingdom to move its political center eastward. The numbers attached to his campaigns are difficult to verify. Qin's military reward system encouraged careful counting, but it also created reasons to inflate claims. Later historians used great totals to demonstrate both Qin's power and the horror of the age. What remains clear is that Bai Qi had accumulated decades of experience in breaking coalitions, maneuvering around fortified positions, and destroying armies after their lines of movement had been compromised. He did not seek victory merely by pushing an enemy off a battlefield. Again and again, his campaigns aimed to leave that enemy without the ability to fight another battle. Zhao was one of the few states strong enough to stand against Qin. Its territory stretched from the North China Plain into mountainous and frontier regions farther north and west. Zhao had developed an important cavalry tradition after King Wuling introduced mounted warfare and riding dress, influenced by the peoples of the northern frontier. But its strength did not rest on cavalry alone. Zhao possessed large infantry armies, fortified cities, and experienced commanders. One of those commanders was Lian Po. He had defeated Qi, held high rank in Zhao, and earned a reputation for discipline and steadiness. Another was Zhao Shi, who had defeated a Qin army at Yanyu in 269 BC by moving quickly through difficult country and attacking before Qin could consolidate its position. That victory demonstrated that Qin could be beaten. It also showed how important the mountain corridors west of Zhao had become. Between Zhao's political heartland around Handan and the Qin-controlled west stood the Taihang Mountains. Roads through these highlands determined whether armies could move between the basins of modern Shanxi and the plains farther east. One of the most important regions there was Shangdang, centered broadly on the Changji Basin. Shangdang belonged to Han, but its importance extended far beyond Han's immediate frontier. It overlooked approaches leading toward Zhao. If Qin controlled the highlands, its armies would gain a forward platform from which they could threaten Zhao's western territories and eventually descend toward Handan. For Han, however, Shangdang was becoming almost impossible to defend. In 265 BC, Qin attacked and seized territory around Yewang, near modern Qinyang. This threatened or severed the southern routes connecting Han's core lands to Shangdang. The mountain commandery became an isolated extension of Han territory, cut off from reliable reinforcement. Qin had not yet taken every city in Shangdang, but it had created the strategic condition it needed. Han could either attempt to hold the region through routes Qin now threatened, or surrender it. Han's government chose surrender. The official responsible for Shangdang, Feng Ting, refused to cooperate. Rather than hand the commandery to Qin, he offered it to Zhao. The proposal placed Zhao's court in a dangerous position. Feng Ting may have hoped that Zhao's acceptance would force Zhao and Han to unite. Qin had fought to isolate Shangdang. If Zhao stepped in at the final moment and claimed it, Qin would almost certainly redirect the war against Zhao. Han, now sharing the danger, might be compelled to support its new partner. From Feng Ting's perspective, transferring Shangdang transformed a doomed local defense into a wider coalition war. From Zhao's perspective, it looked both like an extraordinary opportunity and a carefully constructed trap. King Shaocheng of Zhao called his advisors. Zhao Bao argued against accepting the territory. Shangdang was not being offered freely. It was land Han could no longer protect, and Qin had already paid the military cost of isolating it. If Zhao accepted, it would also accept Qin's anger and the responsibility for defending a region already under attack. Lord Pingyuan favored acceptance. Shangdang was strategically valuable. Allowing Qin to occupy it without resistance would place Qin above Zhao's western approaches. What appeared to be caution could simply postpone the same war until Qin held a better position. Later historians often portrayed Zhao's choice as an act of greed. The reality was more severe. Zhao was choosing between two risks. It could reject Shangdang and permit Qin to consolidate the highlands, or accept the region and fight before Qin's position became even stronger. King Shaocheng accepted Feng Ting's offer. The decision solved the immediate question of who claimed Shangdang. It also ensured that Zhao would become Qin's next major opponent. The political struggle over the region appears to have begun around 262 BC. The main fighting described in the surviving narrative occurred in 260. This distinction matters because Changping was not necessarily one continuous three-year battle. It was the violent conclusion of a longer crisis, in which roads were cut, alliances failed, territory changed hands, and both sides prepared for a decisive campaign. Feng Ting's plan depended on Han and Zhao confronting Qin together. Qin moved to prevent that. In 261 BC, Qin forces operated farther south, crossing the Yellow River, and taking positions that threatened Han's capital region. The message was unmistakable. If Han attempted to strike Qin's rear or reopen the routes to Shangdang, it would expose its own political center. Han turned inward to protect itself. Zhao had accepted Shangdang, but not the effective military alliance that was supposed to make the transfer survivable. By 260 BC, Qin was ready to finish the conquest of the highlands. The commander of the initial offensive was Wang He, an experienced Qin general whose name is rendered differently in some translations. He advanced into Shangdang as its defenders and inhabitants withdrew northward. Behind them came Qin troops. Ahead lay the Zhao army under Lian Po. The movement toward Changping was not simply a meeting of two field armies. Shangdang's displaced population was also moving north. Roads through the valleys carried soldiers, carts, grain, animals, weapons, craftsmen, and refugees. Zhao had to protect the people who had rejected Qin rule while establishing a defensible position before Wang He overtook them. Lian Po chose Changping, northwest of modern Gaoping. The region offered several defensive advantages. The Dan River crossed the battlefield zone. Ridges and high ground restricted movement. Roads passed through valleys that could be watched or blocked. Rather than one open plain, Changping consisted of connected camps, crossings, walls, hills, and narrow corridors. Lian Po did not try to recover every part of Shangdang immediately. He positioned Zhao to protect the approaches eastward. By accepting ground closer to Zhao, he shortened his own communications and forced Qin to operate farther from its western bases. Yet the terrain created another problem. A large army concentrated in a mountain basin required a constant flow of grain. The soldiers at the front were only part of the burden. Zhao also had to support drivers, camp laborers, craftsmen, animals, and many of the people displaced from Shangdang. If the campaign became a test of endurance, both sides would suffer. The question was, which state could sustain the effort longer? The first clash recorded by Sima Qian occurred in the fourth month of 260 BC. A Zhao forward force, commanded by a deputy general named Jia, encountered Qin troops, described in one reconstruction as scouts or an advance detachment. The Zhao force attacked, perhaps because it believed the Qin troops were vulnerable or outnumbered. The engagement ended badly. Qin defeated the detachment and killed Jia. It was a limited action, but it established the pattern of the early campaign. Zhao's forward troops were willing to contest the advance. Qin repeatedly punished them for doing so. In the sixth month, Wang He attacked Zhao's outer defensive line. Qin troops captured 2 fortified positions and killed or took several Zhao officers of senior rank. The losses forced Lian Po to pull back towards stronger defenses. The following month, Qin attacked again. 2 more Zhao officers were killed, and Qin seized a western camp. These were not merely points on a map. Each lost fort reduced Zhao's ability to observe Qin movements and control the approaches to its main position. Each dead officer removed a man responsible for transmitting orders and holding units together. Qin was reducing Zhao's defensive system one section at a time. Lian Po adjusted. Rather than continue exchanging troops and officers for forward ground, he concentrated behind his main fortifications. The Zhao camps and walls extended across a broad area, using the Dan River and the surrounding terrain as part of the defensive plan. A later geographical work states that the 2 armies drew water from the same flowing river, suggesting how closely their positions faced one another. Qin challenged Zhao to fight. Lian Po refused. It was not the decision of a commander who had achieved everything he wanted. He had already lost men, officers, forts, and ground. But he had preserved Zhao's principal army, and that army remained the one thing Qin needed to destroy before it could advance toward Handan. Behind prepared defenses, Zhao's infantry and crossbowmen could make a Qin assault costly. Qin could raid, challenge, and pressure the camps, but it could not easily compel Lian Po to expose his army. The initiative now shifted away from the battlefield. At Handan, King Xiaocheng received reports of the campaign. Zhao had accepted Shangdang to prevent Qin from controlling the highlands, yet Qin had overrun much of the region and pushed Zhao back. Senior officers had been killed. Important positions had fallen. Lian Po's army remained in place, but it would not attack. From the king's perspective, the strategy carried no obvious endpoint. Zhao had to continue sending grain and manpower west, while Qin occupied contested territory. Waiting might exhaust Qin, but it might exhaust Zhao first. Ancient diplomatic traditions claim that Zhao sought grain from Qi and failed to obtain it. The details are uncertain, but the underlying pressure is credible. Hundreds of thousands of men associated with a campaign could consume the resources of a state without moving a single mile. King Xiaocheng repeatedly criticized Lian Po for refusing battle. Lian Po did not change his plan. The early fighting had demonstrated the danger of meeting Qin in the open. Every day behind the walls preserved the army, yet every day also weakened the king's confidence in the commander who had chosen to wait. Qin's chief minister, Fan Zhu, allegedly exploited that division. According to Sima Qian, Qin agents spent money circulating rumors in Zhao. The claim was that Qin did not fear Lian Po. The only Zhao commander Qin truly feared was Zhao Kuo, the son of Zhao Shi. The story fits the strategic result almost perfectly, perhaps too perfectly. Modern historians have questioned whether Zhao's king would choose a commander simply because enemy rumors praised him. Zhao Kuo was a high-ranking member of a known military family. The court did not need Qin agents to tell it who he was. More importantly, King Xiaocheng already had practical reasons to be dissatisfied with Lian Po. The disinformation may have reinforced a decision, taking shape for other reasons. Zhao wanted a commander who would attack. Zhao Kuo offered that possibility. His father, Zhao Shi, had been one of the few generals to defeat Qin in a major operation. At Yanyu, Zhao Shi had rejected caution, moved rapidly, seized favorable ground, and struck Qin before it could prepare. That victory gave his family unusual prestige. Later accounts describe Zhao Kuo as a gifted student of military texts who could speak fluently about strategy but lacked the judgment to apply it. His father supposedly warned that the young man treated war too casually. His mother reportedly asked the king not to appoint him. The statesman Lin Xingru is said to have compared the appointment to trying to play an instrument after fixing its tuning pegs in place. Those stories became part of the moral memory of Changping. Zhao Kuo gave rise to the enduring image of the commander who could discuss war on paper but could not command on a battlefield. They should not be mistaken for a complete biography. They were preserved by writers who knew how his campaign ended, and they explain disaster by placing it in the character of one man. The historical Zhao Kuo was not an unknown civilian, handed an army because he had read a few books. He belonged to a leading military family and possessed sufficient standing for the king to entrust him with Zhao's most important command. His exact experience is not recorded. Neither is the full argument he presented to the court. What can be reconstructed is the expectation attached to his appointment. He was not being sent to maintain Lian Po's policy. He was being sent to change it. King Xiaocheng removed Lian Po and placed Zhao Kuo in command. News of the change reached Qin. The response was immediate and secret. King Zhaoxiang appointed Bai Qi to replace Wang He as supreme commander at Changping. Wang Hu remained as his deputy. According to Sima Qian, Qin threatened punishment for anyone who revealed that Bai Qi had arrived. The secrecy served a clear purpose. Zhao had publicly changed commanders and strategy. Qin wanted Zhao Kuo to proceed without knowing that Qin had placed its most experienced general opposite him. When Zhao Kuo reached Changping, he inherited an army that had been fighting, retreating, digging, and waiting for months. Its forward positions had been damaged, but its core remained protected behind an established defensive system. The position he inherited was more than a collection of camps. It was the result of every concession Lian Po had made since the first fighting. Forward ground had been abandoned so the main body could remain intact. Walls, ditches, river crossings, and guarded roads tied the sections together. Grain came from the east, passed through the rear zone, and moved forward to the camps. As long as those connections remained open, Zhao could lose local engagements without losing the army. Zhao Kuo was expected to produce something that this system had not delivered, a visible reversal. He could not return to Handan merely having preserved the same fortified line. The court had removed Lian Po because defense without an end had become unacceptable. That political demand followed the new commander all the way to Changping. Traditional accounts claim he replaced officers and altered Lian Po's regulations. The extent of those changes is unknown. What mattered most was his operational decision. Zhao Kuo prepared to attack. The decision was not entirely irrational. Lian Po's strategy could succeed only if Qin's supply system failed before Zhao's. The Zhao court had already concluded that continued waiting was dangerous. An offensive offered a chance to drive Qin away, recover lost ground, and end the burden before Zhao's own resources ran out. But attacking required Zhao to surrender the principal advantage Lian Po had preserved. The army would have to move away from its strongest walls and expose the roads connecting it to the rear. Bai Qi waited for that movement. When Zhao advanced, Qin troops gave ground. The first withdrawals gave Zhao no obvious reason to stop. Qin abandoned positions that it had previously fought to hold. Zhao formations crossed ground that had been denied to them for months. Reports moving back through the columns would naturally describe progress, another position taken, another Qin unit withdrawing, another stretch of road reopened. What the advancing troops could not see was more important. Bai Qi did not need every Qin unit to retreat in the same direction. While the visible front drew Zhao forward, other formations could move through adjoining valleys and behind ridges. A commander near the front might know that Qin was yielding ground ahead without knowing that Qin troops were already approaching the roads behind him. The battlefield rewarded Bai Qi's deception. On an open plain, a large cavalry movement might be visible from miles away. At Changping, high ground and broken valleys divided the fighting into separate fields of view. Information traveled with messengers, and a message described conditions that might already have changed by the time it arrived. From inside Zhao's army, the retreat would not have appeared as a complete strategic picture. Officers in one part of the battlefield could see Qing abandoning a position. Units elsewhere might receive reports through messengers only after the situation had changed. Ridges, bends in the valleys, distance, and the movement of large formations limited what any commander could observe directly. Zhao Kuo saw Qin withdrawing and continued the attack. Bai Qi's retreat remained controlled. Qin forces did not dissolve into fugitives. They drew Zhao toward prepared positions, while other units moved beyond the immediate view of the advancing army. The farther Zhao pushed forward, the more successful the offensive appeared. Ground lost under Lian Po was being recovered. Qin was no longer challenging Zhao from outside its walls. Qin was pulling back. That apparent success created the next danger. The main Zhao field force was moving farther from the fortified camps that had protected it and farther from the supply system running eastward. Not every Zhao soldier left the original defensive zone. Some forces remained behind. This division was essential to Bai Qi's plan. He did not need to surround every Zhao formation in one enormous circle. He needed to separate the advancing army from the troops, roads, and supplies behind it. Once Zhao's main body had moved into the exposed corridor, Bai Qi gave the order. Sima Qian records that 25,000 Qin troops moved behind Zhao's advance and cut its route of retreat. Another 5,000 cavalrymen severed communications between Zhao Kuo's main force and the troops remaining near the original defenses. The timing mattered more than the raw numbers. If these troops moved too early, Zhao could recognize the danger before committing its main body. If they moved too late, Zhao might break Qin's forward position or withdraw in good order. Bai Qi waited until the offensive had created enough distance between Zhao Quo's field force and the rear camps, then inserted his troops into that space. The figures come from a source written more than a century after the battle, but the maneuver itself fits the terrain. Changping's valleys offered only a limited number of useful roads and crossings. A blocking force did not have to form an unbroken ring around hundreds of thousands of people. It had to reach the places through which those people and their supplies were forced to move. Qin cavalry was particularly useful for this purpose. Its task was not simply to charge a mass of infantry from the flank. Mounted troops could move rapidly between roads, seize crossings, intercept messengers, attack convoys, and reinforce threatened gaps before slower Zhao formations could respond. The trap was dangerous even for Qin. The blocking troops were much smaller than the total Zhao force. If Zhao reacted immediately, concentrated against one corridor, and reopened the road before Qin reinforced it, the encirclement might collapse. But the division of the battlefield delayed a coordinated response. Zhao Quo's forward army faced Qin's main position. Zhao troops in the rear faced the new blocking forces. Neither section could easily see what the other was doing, and messengers now had to cross ground controlled by Qin. A messenger sent from the forward army could be intercepted before reaching the old camps. A grain convoy moving from the east could arrive at a road it had used days earlier and find Qin soldiers across it. Troops stationed in Zhao's rear might hear that the main army had advanced successfully, while confronting an enemy that should not have been behind them at all. None of these problems required Qin to defeat the entire Zhao force at once. Together, they prevented its separated parts from acting as one army. The offensive had split into two separate battles. Zhao Quo pressed ahead and attacked the Qin troops that had appeared to retreat. They no longer gave ground. Bai Qi had drawn Zhao toward prepared fortifications, where Qin infantry and missile troops could resist without exposing the army to a general engagement. The reversal was complete. Under Lien Po, Zhao had waited behind walls while Qin tried to provoke it into attacking. Now Qin stood behind prepared defenses, and Zhao had to break through before its rear was permanently sealed. Zhao assaulted the Qin position and failed. Each unsuccessful attack gave the blocking forces more time. Qin strengthened the captured roads and valley exits. What had begun as a fast maneuver became a fortified line between Zhao Quo and his original camps. Turning back was no easier. Zhao could not simply reverse thousands of men in confined terrain and force them through a route now occupied by Qin. Units had to be reorganized. Orders had to travel through a crowded battlefield. Attacks against the rear blockade had to be coordinated with the troops left outside it. Qin's cavalry worked to prevent exactly that coordination. As the day's local fighting continued, the larger meaning of the situation became clear. Zhao's main army had not been defeated in a single collision. It had lost control of its movement. Food was the next weapon. Bai Qi's encirclement was not complete merely because Qin held the roads. Zhao could still be rescued. A relief army might attack from outside, while Zhao Quo struck from within. Supply convoys might find minor routes through the mountains. A sudden concentrated assault might overwhelm one of the blocking positions. Qin needed more men to secure every critical approach. King Zhaoxiang responded with an emergency mobilization. The king reportedly traveled to Henei, granted the population an additional rank, and ordered males over the age of 15 to assist the campaign. The age threshold may represent the dramatic language of mass mobilization rather than a perfectly documented census order. Even so, the episode reveals the scale of Qin's commitment. Fresh manpower moved to the approaches. Qin reinforced roads and crossings, blocked Zhao relief forces, and protected the supply system feeding Bai Qi's army. Men who may never have served as frontline soldiers could guard routes, move grain, repair roads, build works, and free trained troops for combat. This was where Qin's administrative strength became inseparable from Bai Qi's generalship. His maneuver had created the opportunity. The state mobilized the resources needed to preserve it. Inside the encirclement, Zhao's stores began to disappear. An army consumed grain at a relentless rate. Men needed food whether they were fighting or waiting. Draft animals and cavalry horses required fodder. Water might be available from the river and local streams, but water alone could not sustain the trapped population. Commanders could reduce rations and preserve what remained for the fighting units. Animals used for transport could be slaughtered, but consuming them solved one problem by creating another. Every lost horse or draft animal reduced the army's ability to move equipment if a road reopened. Every abandoned cart made a rapid withdrawal more difficult. The trapped force was consuming not only its food, but the machinery it would need to escape. The larger the ancient total, the faster this crisis would have developed. Hundreds of thousands of people could not live from the surrounding valley once organized supply stopped. Local stores had already been strained by months of campaigning. Qin did not need to occupy every acre of ground. It needed to deny Zhao access to the roads and settlements from which meaningful quantities of grain could come. Zhao's army probably included large numbers of support personnel who were not heavily armed combatants. Before the encirclement, they had enabled the fighting force to function. They drove carts, prepared food, repaired equipment, handled animals, and carried supplies. Once the routes closed, they became additional people drawing from the same shrinking stores. The Shiji says Zhao remained surrounded for 46 days. During that time, Qin did not need to destroy the army through repeated frontal attacks. It needed to prevent escape and resupply. Zhao could still fight, but each passing day reduced the strength available for the next attempt. The situation outside the pocket was equally important. Zhao troops left near the original defensive works had not vanished, but they could not simply march through the Qin blockade. Any relief effort had to approach along predictable mountain routes and coordinate with Zhao Kuo across a barrier controlled by the enemy. Qin's emergency reinforcements were positioned to keep those forces apart. This was why the encirclement did not require a continuous ring of Qin soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder around the entire Zhao population. The landscape performed part of the work. Ridges, river crossings, narrow exits, and fortified roadblocks channeled movement into places where Qin could concentrate. Zhao possessed numbers, but Bai Qi controlled where those numbers could be used. Reports from outside the encirclement would have been delayed, incomplete, or non-existent. Zhao Kuo could not know with certainty whether Handan was sending relief, whether the troops behind him had found a weak point, or how long Qin could maintain the blockade. The Zhao court, in turn, may have received only fragments from a battlefield whose communications were now controlled by the enemy. Ancient sources claim conditions became so severe that Zhao soldiers secretly killed and ate one another. That detail cannot be independently verified and belongs to a tradition that emphasized the extremity of the disaster. The starvation itself is entirely credible. By the end of a prolonged blockade, animals would be consumed, rations reduced, and organized units weakened. Bai Qi allowed time to work. This restraint was as important as the original deception. A less disciplined commander might have attacked the surrounded army immediately, creating a chance for Zhao to concentrate its remaining strength and break through in the confusion. Bai Qi instead held the routes and made Zhao spend its strength in unsuccessful assaults. The balance had changed with every day. At the beginning of the encirclement, Zhao possessed a powerful army cut off from supply. By the end, it possessed hungry formations whose physical ability to break a fortified blockade had been severely reduced. Zhao Kuo eventually faced the choice that Lian Po had spent months trying to avoid. Remaining in position no longer preserved the army. It guaranteed its collapse. He organized the survivors into multiple formations and ordered a breakout. The precise sequence of these final attacks is not preserved. Sima Qian tells us they failed, and that Zhao Kuo personally went out with elite troops to fight. Qin missile fire killed him. Whether the fatal shot came from a bow or crossbow cannot be known. Both were used during the period, and crossbows were particularly effective from prepared positions. What matters is that Zhao Kuo died while attempting to break the encirclement his offensive had helped create. The death of a commander did not automatically destroy an ancient army, but under these conditions it removed the last center of coordinated authority. The troops had no food, no open road, and no clear prospect of relief. Their field force was separated from the rear. Their final breakout had failed. The Zhao army surrendered. The surrender was probably not one perfectly coordinated moment across the entire battlefield. Zhao's formations had been divided, weakened, and deprived of their commander. Some groups may have stopped fighting before others. The surviving sources do not preserve those details. What they record is the strategic result. Zhao's field army and the forces connected to it passed into Qin hands in numbers that astonished later generations. Sima Qian gives the number of surrendered men as approximately 400,000, and the total Zhao loss over the entire campaign as approximately 450,000. These figures have shaped every later account of Changping, but they require careful treatment. A force of 450,000 fully equipped combat soldiers would create staggering logistical problems. Some modern historians therefore regard the total as exaggerated or symbolic. Large round numbers appear frequently in warring states' narratives, especially when a historian wants to express complete destruction. Other scholars argue that the number becomes more plausible if soldiers includes the entire mobilized population attached to the campaign. Zhao's total may have encompassed infantry, cavalry, officers, drivers, servants, transport laborers, craftsmen, displaced Shangdang inhabitants, and locally mobilized civilians. The Qin army's strength is even less certain. Ancient sources do not provide a reliable total. Modern estimates range from roughly 300,000 to more than 500,000, and popular accounts sometimes go higher. None should be presented as established fact. It is therefore impossible to calculate the battle as if it were a modern engagement with precise personnel reports. But the uncertainty surrounding the number does not erase the event. Zhao suffered a catastrophic loss, and Qin found itself responsible for a captive population large enough to create an immediate strategic danger. The prisoners had to be disarmed, separated, guarded, and fed. Qin was operating in territory whose population had rejected its rule. If the Zhao captives were released, many could return to military service. If they remained together, they might overwhelm their guards or join a local uprising. Transporting them west would require food and security along mountain roads already burdened by the campaign. Nor could Qin simply treat the captives as a normal addition to its population while the war continued. Many came from Zhao. Others may have been residents of Shangdang who had already refused Qin authority. Their homes and loyalties lay east of the new frontier. Keeping such a force concentrated near Changping meant leaving a second army behind Bai Qi, an army that had surrendered only because it was starving. Bai Qi made his calculation. According to the Shiji, he argued that Qin had already taken Shangdang, but its people did not want to become Qin subjects. They had gone over to Zhao. The surrendered soldiers were therefore unreliable. Unless they were all killed, he feared they would create disorder. This explanation may have referred not only to Zhao's regular troops, but also to Shangdang men who had changed allegiance. From Qin's perspective, they had refused one surrender, joined Zhao, and now surrendered again only after being starved into submission. Bai Qi ordered nearly all the captives killed. The surviving Chinese term is often translated into English as buried alive. That translation is too precise. The word keng, especially in accounts of mass violence, can mean killing people and disposing of them in pits. It does not demonstrate that hundreds of thousands of men were placed alive underground. The exact method is unknown. Captives may have been separated into groups, deceived about their fate, killed by weapons, and then thrown or buried in mass graves. Later tradition transformed this into the more vivid image of an entire army buried alive. Sima Qian says only 240 of the youngest prisoners were spared and sent back to Zhao. If the purpose was to spread terror, the survivors carried a message more powerful than any official proclamation. Zhao had not merely lost a battle or surrendered a piece of territory. Its main army had disappeared, and almost none of the men who laid down their weapons were coming home. The killing was strategically ruthless. It denied Zhao the chance to recover trained manpower. It reduced the danger of revolt behind Qin's lines. It also ensured that future Zhao resistance would be fought by people who knew what surrender at Changping had meant. More than 2,000 years later, the ground around Gaoping continued to produce evidence of violent death. In 1995, villagers near Yonglu uncovered human bones while working the land. Archaeological investigation identified pits containing the remains of adult males, some showing evidence of arrow wounds, cutting injuries, blunt force trauma, and decapitation. Weapons and objects associated with the Warring States era were also found. Other remains and possible burial locations have been identified across the wider battlefield region. The discoveries confirm that Changping and its surroundings witnessed mass violence and the disposal of bodies in pits. They do not confirm every part of Sima Qian's narrative. A mass grave cannot identify itself as one section of the 260 BC surrender without additional evidence. The battlefield covered a large area and experienced fighting over time. Nor can the excavated remains establish that exactly 400,000 people died, that all were prisoners, or that they were buried alive. The responsible conclusion lies between denial and literal acceptance. The ancient figure may be inflated. It may include non-combatants and support workers. It may have become a symbolic number expressing the annihilation of Zhao's military population. But Changping was not invented. The destruction was real, the killing was enormous, and Zhao's ability to wage war was permanently damaged. Bai Qi now stood at the high point of his career. Qin controlled the battlefield, much of Shangdang, and the western approaches to Zhao. Handan lay beyond the mountains, shaken by the loss of the army meant to protect it. Bai Qi wanted to continue. An immediate advance offered Qin its best chance to destroy Zhao before it could fortify the capital, recruit new troops, or obtain help from other states. The surviving Zhao population had suffered a shock that could not quickly be repaired. If Qin allowed time to pass, the political effects of the massacre might work against it. Qin did advance into additional territory, but it did not immediately commit Bai Qi to the final attack. Zhao pursued negotiations. Han and Zhao offered concessions. Fan Zhu supported ending the campaign. Later accounts introduce a political motive. A persuader allegedly warned Fan Zhu that if Bai Qi conquered Zhao, the general's prestige would exceed that of the minister. Fan Zhu therefore advised King Zhaoxiang to accept peace and rest the army. Personal rivalry may have played a role, but there were also practical reasons to pause. Qin's army had conducted a long and difficult campaign. It had to secure conquered territory and maintain supply routes through the mountains. Even victorious states could exhaust themselves. The decision brought Qin land and temporary relief. It also gave Zhao the one resource it desperately needed: time. Handan strengthened its defenses. Zhao's remaining leaders sought allies. The massacre at Changping showed the other states what might happen if Zhao were destroyed, and Qin gained uncontested access to the North China Plain. When Qin renewed the offensive, the strategic situation had changed. King Zhaoxiang wanted Bai Qi to command the attack on Handan. Bai Qi refused. He argued that the opportunity created by Changping had passed. Zhao now defended its capital with the desperation of a state facing destruction. Other kingdoms were more likely to intervene. Qin would be operating deeper in hostile territory against a fortified city rather than an isolated field army. Bai Qi reportedly cited illness, but his strategic objection was clear. A victory at Changping did not mean every subsequent campaign would be favorable. The king sent other commanders. Qin besieged Handan, but the capital held. The fighting dragged on through 259, 258, and into 257 BC. Zhao suffered terribly, yet it was no longer alone. Wei and Chu eventually sent assistance. Political maneuvering within Wei delayed intervention, but forces associated with Lord Xinling finally moved to Zhao's aid. The Qin army was driven back. Zhao survived. The failure at Handan did not undo Changping. Zhao had saved its capital, but it could not restore the men lost in the highlands. The dead and captured had included more than soldiers. They represented officers, agricultural workers, transport personnel, craftsmen, and future recruits. Their absence weakened both the army and the society required to support it. Zhao remained capable of resistance. In later decades, the general Li Mu won important defensive victories and prevented Qin from advancing easily through the north. That survival is important because it prevents Changping from becoming a false story of immediate and inevitable conquest. Qin did not unify China in 260 BC. It suffered reverses, changed plans, and required nearly 4 more decades to defeat all its rivals. Yet the balance had shifted. Before Changping, Zhao had been one of the few states capable of confronting Qin with a major field army. After Changping, it depended increasingly on fortified defense, exceptional commanders, and temporary alliances. It could stop Qin in particular campaigns, but it could no longer compete with Qin's resources over the long term. Bai Qi did not live to see the final result. His refusal to command at Handan damaged his relationship with King Zhaoxiang. As Qin's difficulties increased, the king again ordered him to take the field. Bai Qi continued to resist. What he considered sound strategic judgment appeared to the court as defiance. He was stripped of rank and ordered to leave the capital. In 257 BC, only a few years after Changping, King Zhaoxiang forced him to commit suicide. Sima Qian gives Bai Qi a moral ending. The general is said to have reflected that he deserved death because of the massacre of Zhao's surrendered soldiers. Whether he spoke those words cannot be verified. Ancient historians often shaped a powerful man's death into a judgment on his life. The judgment endured because Bai Qi's achievement and his brutality could not be separated. At Changping, he demonstrated extraordinary control over movement, timing, terrain, deception, and logistics. He did not defeat Zhao by winning a conventional head-on collision. He allowed Zhao to advance, occupied the roads behind it, divided its forces, resisted its attacks, and waited for hunger to finish the work. Then, after the army surrendered, he made certain it could never be rebuilt. Zhao Kuo received a different historical sentence. His name became associated with military knowledge that exists only in theory. Generations remembered him as the inexperienced commander who abandoned a successful defensive strategy and led hundreds of thousands of men into Bai Qi's trap. There is truth in that judgment, but not the whole truth. Zhao Kuo's offensive was the decisive battlefield error. By pursuing Qin beyond the security of the fortified line, he exposed the communications on which his army depended. Once those routes were cut, every failed assault made the situation worse. But Zhao's crisis did not originate with him. Qin had isolated Shangdang before he took command. Han had failed to support Zhao. Wang He had defeated Zhao's forward troops, captured forts, and killed senior officers. The Zhao court faced a growing supply burden and had lost confidence in Lian Po's ability to change the campaign. Zhao Kuo entered a war already shaped by political pressure, previous defeats, difficult terrain, and Qin's superior preparation. His mistake transformed a dangerous situation into a catastrophe, but he did not create every condition that made the catastrophe possible. Lian Po's reputation also deserves careful treatment. His fortified defense prevented Qin from obtaining the battle it wanted. Keeping him in command might have preserved the army. Yet there is no certainty that Zhao could have outlasted Qin. His forces had already been pushed back, and the cost of feeding them was placing enormous strain on Zhao. The tragedy of Changping was not that one side possessed a perfect answer and abandoned it. Zhao had only bad choices, while Qin had spent years narrowing those choices. The decision to accept Shangdang placed Zhao in the path of Qin's expansion. Refusing the territory might have allowed Qin to occupy the highlands without a major fight. Accepting it forced Zhao to defend a frontier shaped by Qin's previous conquests. Lian Po's decision to withdraw preserved the army, but transferred pressure to the Zhao court and supply system. The king's decision to replace him promised a faster conclusion, but abandoned the strongest protection Zhao possessed. Zhao Kuo's decision to attack recovered the initiative briefly, but opened the road behind his army. Bai Qi's decision to retreat surrendered ground, but gained control over Zhao's movement. Each solution created the next problem. The battle also revealed the nature of the states fighting it. Zhao could raise an enormous military population and place experienced commanders in the field. Qin could do the same, but it combined battlefield maneuver with a deeper administrative capacity. When Bai Qi needed roads sealed, King Zhaoxiang mobilized Henei. When the encirclement needed time, Qin kept the outside supply system functioning. When Zhao needed relief, Qin prevented Han from intervening and blocked the routes through which aid might come. Changping was therefore a battle of institutions as much as commanders. Bai Qi's plan succeeded because Qin could support it. 39 years later, in 221 BC, King Zheng of Qin completed the conquest of the rival states and declared himself the first emperor. Zhao had fallen several years earlier, after Qin exploited internal division and the removal of Li Mu, the last commander capable of repeatedly stopping its armies. Changping did not make that outcome inevitable. Qin still had to recover from Handan, overcome coalitions, defeat major generals, and sustain decades of further war. But the battle removed the strongest body of manpower Zhao would ever place in the field. It gave Qin control of strategic ground and left Zhao fighting for survival rather than supremacy. The battlefield near modern Gaoping preserves no complete record of the men who died there. The bones found in its soil can reveal injury, violent death, and mass disposal. They cannot tell us the exact size of the armies, the precise sequence of every assault, or whether Sima Qian's figure of 400,000 was a count, an estimate, or a symbol of destruction. Nor can the evidence confirm the familiar claim that all the prisoners were buried alive. The more defensible conclusion is that they were massacred and buried in pits by methods that remain uncertain. Those distinctions matter. Changping does not need exaggeration to remain horrifying. Its history rests on a sequence of documented choices. Han decided it could no longer defend Shangdang. Feng Ting offered the region to Zhao. Zhao accepted. Lian Po withdrew behind fortifications. King Xiaocheng rejected continued waiting. Zhao Kuo attacked. Bai Qi retreated, closed the roads, and allowed starvation to destroy the army. After the surrender, he ordered the prisoners killed. The massacre is what made Changping infamous. The maneuver that preceded it is what made the massacre possible. Bai Qi understood that Zhao's army did not have to be crushed everywhere at once. It needed to be separated from its defenses, its supplies, and its route home. Once those connections were gone, its great size became a burden. Every additional man required food. Every blocked road increased the confusion. Every day reduced the strength available for escape. At Changping, Qin did more than defeat an army. It destroyed Zhao's ability to compete with Qin on equal terms. What disappeared in those valleys was not merely a generation of soldiers. It was the best remaining chance that one powerful state might stop Qin before Qin's wars transformed the divided kingdoms of ancient China into a single empire.